morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon or evening, whenever you're watching this on Crops TV. My name is Mike Witt. I'm a field agronomist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach in West Central Iowa. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Iowa State University On-Farm Trials. Another part of my job is I am the coordinator for these ISU On-Farm Trials across the state. And what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk a little bit about different results that we had in these trials, what these trials are, and just really give you an overview of things that farmers are looking at. So with ISU On-Farm Trials, like I said, it's Iowa State professionals providing guidance to farmers. And the key part of that phrase is the end that says that answer relevant questions. These questions are not questions that Iowa State University comes up with or questions that myself or members of my team come up with. They're ones that farmers themselves look at, decide, I want to try this new product. I want to look at this new practice. How do I go about getting an answer from that other than just data that I see out in the world, the things you see on the internet, in which everything always gains you yield? What are the actual questions and the actual answers? So these, again, are going to be local-based questions and local-based answers. The farmers definitely take the lead on these trials because they're demonstration-based. And what I mean by that is, in a research trial, you have a lot of replication and a lot of parameters that are exactly the same. The same plot width, the same plot distance, the same machine combines those individual plots across a large geography. Now, with these trials, they are 100% farmer-driven in that if a farmer has a 30-foot head for their combine, then their strips are 30 feet wide. If they have a 4-row, 6-row, 8-row for their corn, then again, that is the size of the plots. The main reason for that is because that way we can have it that farmers will have that lead and have that buy-in, and you're not just out there doing a trial for someone else. It's something that's really relevant that you're looking for. And another reason why they're demonstration-based is these trials are snapshots on a yearly basis of one individual's farm. A lot of these trials don't have the repeatability across a lot of areas. So you'll see that in the descriptions that we'll see later. We have the farming practices that are utilized. We will have the county that it's in. So if you can look up in the state of Iowa, you can determine what county we're talking about. We'll also have other relevant factors such as population, planting date, harvest date, and things like that, so that you can look at that, compare that to your own system and see, well, this isn't really what fits in mine. This data point might not be good for me, but for others in the state, it's going to be very relevant and very important. So again, with the demonstration, their snapshots are not very repeatable across multiple environments on most of the trials. Now, you will see some trials where we did have the same protocol across locations, and in those we'll talk about that and talk about what were the different things that we saw to be able to look at that data across the state of Iowa. In 2020, we had a few changes. We had the trial breakdown, as you can see. We had 86 trials, 9 categories across the entire state. However, one of the big things that happened this year was due to COVID-19, we were not able to do as many trials with local farmer cooperators. We weren't able to go out to their land as often because of social distancing and other guidelines. However, a lot of the studies that we did, we still spoke with farmers, spoke with them and said, what would you have liked to have seen on your farm this year? And we took that and replicated that and put that on the ISU research farms in order to find out what those answers were and tried to get as close as we could to the relevance in there. As you see on this next slide, the Iowa State research farms are located all across the state, and we had trials at most of these farms. Now, you will also see the website that's below, the Iowa State Digital Press. That is where all of these reports, I'm going to go over a lot of data later on, all of the reports for that will be posted on these farm reports, and you can search based on individual farms and determine, okay, if you're interested in the Western Research Farm because you're over in Monona County or West Central Iowa, all right, you might look at trials that were from that specific area and not focus on the one in Southeast Iowa or Northeast, because that might not have the same situations as you would be looking at as far as soil type or even farming practices. But again, we have a lot of different locations across the state. Now I'm going to show you the contacts, and these are the individuals who are members of my team. All of these individuals here will be more than happy to take your phone call, an email, and talk to you about the on-farm trials, as well as determine if that's something you would like to do, or just with general questions on these. I'm going to display all of these for a few seconds on each of these slides, because that way I understand while we're watching Crops TV, we have the ability to pause and go back and get phone numbers and get emails if there are individuals that you would like to talk to in your given area. This slide here is the central and southern locations. As you can see, we have Ames all the way down to Sheraton, and then over to Crawfordsville. And then in the north and northeastern contacts, we have up by Kanawha and then by Nashua, as well as some other locations in which we've had a lot of these trials. Now again, like I said, all of these people, talk to your local individual. If they're not able to help you, then you can feel free to contact me. My contact information will be in the last slide, so you can do that. And we can definitely work with you to figure out if a trial is something that you are looking for. And if you're curious about that, here's how it works. These trials are basic strip trial designs. So with a strip trial, again, the size of the strip is determined by the individual farmer's equipment, so it can be different at each location. There's multiple replications within a field, and we'll talk about replication a little bit later as to why we do that. But again, it fits the individual farmer's operations and the equipment available, and complexity is something that we in the on-farm program don't like to deal with, is the best way to put that. We prefer to keep things simple. We prefer to have just one variable that we're looking at. A lot of times that variable is going to be yield. If we change one practice, does that one practice affect the yield in a statistically significant way? Either affects it in there's more yield, there's less yield, or there's no yield change at all. All three of those answers are very important. But again, when we get into multiple different factors or treatments within a project, then noise can occur in that data. And we have some of those trials, and we'll discuss those a little later. So randomization and replication. What I'm talking about with randomization is, again, as it says on the slide, it reduces the odds of unforeseen noise. What that is, if you look at the picture up above, you can see that landscape is not the same. And if you just did one replication or just had one randomization in there and had all of the, shall we say, all of one treatment on the left side and all of another treatment on the right side, well, that's not really a fair comparison across the field. So what we do is we randomize strips so that we can parse out some of that field variability that is out there. And then again, replication, if you just have one treatment of something, you don't know if it's very, very good in that one particular spot in the field or if it's good across multiple areas. Because we all know there's wet spots, that picture above, there's some weedier areas, and there's a draw in there on the bottom left of that picture. So again, having randomization that will go across that field and replication within there really helps to reduce that field variability or that noise in the data so we can actually get a real accurate result on what we're looking at. Here's some suggested plot layouts that I've seen over the years. Again, none of these are 100% specific. They aren't something that you have to have. But again, they aren't just A, B, one versus the other right next to each other in the field. You can see there's randomization that goes on. And again, the plot layout on the right, which that one would be the squared version where everything is a square. And on the left, we know that Mother Nature and Earth doesn't always make square fields. So we're able to do trials in non-square situations as well, just as easy as that square. So next we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between average values and the significant different values, because this is one of the things that in demonstration trials or in research trials that people can really get confused on. Because if you look at any type of advertising you're going to see, you can almost always see an average yield difference in there. Well, at Iowa State on-farm trials, we can show you averages, but we prefer and we usually show you statistical significance. And with that significance, what it's telling you is it's telling you how accurate and what percentage you feel you are accurate in saying what you're saying. So in reality, is what you're seeing a true effect of the treatment, or is it just the luck of the draw? And we'll look at this here. So if we look at the top example in field 1, you can see what we had is we have a cornfield, and we have a nitrogen rate of, we added 200 pounds of nitrogen, and we added 125 pounds of nitrogen. We have 4 different replications in there, and you can see over on the right side, you can see the average. So for the 200 pounds of nitrogen, we had 187.25 average, and for the 125, we had a yield of 165. Now our significance on that is 0.03. That significance tells me that I am 97% sure that what happened is that nitrogen at this 200 pounds had the effect of adding more yield. And one of the reasons I can say that, not only because of the significance, is if you look at those reps, all 4 of the reps are fairly close to equal, and all 4 of the reps at the 200 pounds are showing more than the 125. So there, our averages are showing, hey, one average more yield. And also, we look and we see, yep, consistently, that's what happened. That gave me the statistical significance. Now, if we look down at field 2, we've got a lot of the same parameters in there as far as pounds of nitrogen, and we even have the same average. But if you look at our significance over there, it is now at 0.66. So with that, that tells me I am only 34% positive that the treatment had the effect. Well, what's the difference? If you're just looking at average, it's exactly the same. So you might not know if all you're getting is average reported. And that's a lot of times what happens in non-statistically reported data that you might see in a magazine article or other things where you're like, we're going to give you a yield advantage. They're not lying to you. The average does say they're getting a yield advantage, but is it really a true advantage? So if we look at the reps in field 2, you will see that the reps are a little bit more variable. In fact, they're a lot more variable. For the 200 pounds, we have anywhere from 164 up to 212 for a yield. And then if we look at the 125, we again have a 182 to a 143. So as you can see at the 125 pounds, it actually yielded better than 2 of the reps that are at 200. However, also, you notice the average. So what ends up happening in this situation is the statistical significance goes out the window, and it's not very good because, again, I can't consistently say that the 200 bushels out-yielded the 125, even though that's what the average says. So that's one of the things about statistical significance and one of the things about p-values that I wanted to point out, because we will show you a lot of p-values across this presentation. It tells the significance. In agriculture, typically we use significant levels at 0.05 or 0.1. So what I'm saying with that is, if I will say something later on is that is statistically significant, what I'm saying is that I believe with 90% or more certainty that treatment had that effect. Now you will see others that the average isn't there. You might see somewhere it's a significance of 0.2. That would mean it is 80% certain that the treatment has an effect. If that's good enough for you, then that's something you can utilize on your own and you can go back and look at these numbers. But for myself and what we're going to report as significant, we are going to use that typical for agriculture. We're going to do the 0.1, which is a little more typical for demonstration trials. The 0.05 is really research-based trials, and some of our trials are definitely significant at the 0.05 level, but we are going to be used for this and all of our reports as the 0.1. Okay, the trials today that we're going to talk about are all listed below. We're going to look at quite a few different trials. As I said, we have 86 trials that we had over this past year, and we had an array of, shall we say, topics that we looked at. And these topics change every year, but these are the ones that we're going to go over. Now, in looking at these topics, these are not going to cover all 86 trials. There are more that we have that might not be what I would call make the highlight reel as we are going for here. But That does not mean they aren't still very important. It doesn't mean they don't show quite a few things. So I would encourage you, if you see some interesting trials here and you think, I wonder what else they had, go to the website that was posted before. Go back in this presentation, click on it so you can get it. I'll show it again at the end so that you can go back, read these reports for yourself and determine, maybe that's something I want to try, or maybe I'm not sure how they did that, but I would like that data on my farm. Now I'm going to give a call to some of the farm specialists, myself, or other agronomists at Iowa State, and we're going to figure this out. So we'll start off today and we'll look at the disease and pest management trials. For the disease and pest management trials, we have two different trial types that we're going to look at today. We're going to look at a seed treatment trial, and we're also going to look at a corn rootworm trial that we had up in northwest Iowa. So the seed treatment trial that we had, we really did a seed and yield evaluation. And of that yield evaluation, we looked at Saltro, Alevo, and Tripidity, ST, a biostimulant soybean seed treatment, and we looked at this down in southeast Iowa. Now, I display to you the ISU On-farm trial data sheet. This is the only time you're going to see a data sheet like this, but I really wanted to let you know this is the information that we collect. We look at what we had for a topic, we look at the location and the cooperator, we determine all the soil types and a lot of the other information of previous crop tillage, like I said before. Now, we look at all of this information so that if we see some data and we see some noise in the data or something that doesn't make sense, something that might be related to a soil type or a slope or a population, we have that data so we can go back in and make that determination. And you'll notice a little bit later on when I talk about some things, some of them have field observations that we made that really show why that yield could have been affected. Now on the right side, you'll see this is an example of our plot numbers, our treatments, our repetitions, our moisture, and then the yield. And then down at the bottom, I will make that a little bigger. These are the averages. So this is the average yield that we see. So for this particular trial, we noticed that Saltro had a yield of 59.2. The statistical significance of this and the p-value for this trial is 0.002. So that means this trial is very statistically significant. But what is the differences within there? So we look on the trial that has the A's, the B's, and the C's. So anything that has a correlating or corresponding letter, like the Tripidity and the control, that both have a B, those are not statistically different from each other. However, the Saltro with an A is different than the B's, and the A is different than the C's. And conversely, the B's are going to be different in the same way. So as you look at this, if I was to say this trial, what was the determination that we made? We would say that Saltro significantly out-yielded the Tripidity, the control, and the Alevo. And then the Alevo statistically had the least yield over all of the other treatments. Now again, this is just a snapshot in here. You might look at this and say, well, there's not that much difference in yield. That's true. But again, if we go back and we look at the different repetitions and we look at the yield up in there, you can take that, determine the averages, and running the statistics, you can see that it was consistent going in there. The next trial we're going to discuss is going to be corn rootworm. So as you can see, we've got a couple different rootworms here on this picture, rootworm beetles. And what we notice with corn rootworm is we notice a lot of larval injury. These pictures right here, that they disrupt nutrient and water uptake. So they're not good pests to have, and not everybody has them. However, there are in certain pockets of Iowa a lot of corn rootworm pressure, and they make the plants unstable. As you can see, we've got some of the goosenecking and things like that occur, and it can really slow down harvest and can really rob yield. So this is the trial that we looked at. This trial was based out of Sioux County, Iowa. And what we looked at was we looked at a couple different things. I will preface that this field was a corn-on-corn field. This field has been corn-on-corn for quite a while. It also has a high rootworm pressure within this field. So it is a field of known rootworm pressure. It's a corn-on-corn situation. So it is really set up to have corn rootworm resistance issues possibly, or other higher populations of the pest. Again, that might not be the situation you're in. You might have a smaller infestation of corn rootworm, but I wanted to point that out, that in this particular trial, it is a large infestation of the corn rootworm, and we expected there to be some pressure. So if we go through this, we'll first look at this whole trial has some statistical significance to it. Now, if we look at this, we look at the yield. The yield is going to be the green bars. So as you can see, these yields are all statistically significant from each other. So if we look on the left, we have a DeKalb, a smart stack with an insecticide added on top of it. Then the next one, over to the right, we have that same hybrid with that same smart stack configuration of traits, but with no insecticide. Continuing on to the right at the 143 yield, we have that DeKalb number, which is a VT Double Pro, which again is not the smart stack, so we're reducing some of our traits that we can utilize against our pests, but we added the insecticide back in at the same rate that we had for the smart stack, and then over way on the far right, we have that Double Pro with no insecticide. So if we look at the yields, what we can see on the green is that those yields do trend down statistically as we move along. So with the most, shall we say, control, which would be the smart stacks of our traits, and the insecticide added, we do see a significant yield advantage over if we have less traits and no insecticide. But we also saw one of the most interesting things that we saw on there was the use of insecticide. So if we look at the blues are the root ratings, which is the number of nodes with feeding. So each node can cause up to a 15% yield loss. So if we look at the first way on the left, we see that we had 0.28 nodes, and those are averages. So there's not 0.28 nodes out there, but when we average the numbers together of 1/2 to 3/4 of a node, this is some of the numbers we get. But we have 0.28 nodes over on the smart stack with the complete insecticide. We move over to the right. If we still have the smart stack, but we reduce that insecticide, all of a sudden our feeding increased by a total of 1 node. So again, is that, and there was correlating and corresponding yield loss for that. So then we switch over and we look at the double. If we add the insecticide, we had less than 1 node that was destroyed or eaten for feeding. But if we go with the Double Pro plus no insecticide far to the right, we can see that there is almost a 2.5 node reduction or feeding that is in there, which has caused the yield reduction that we've seen. So again, in this situation, some of the conclusions that we came to in this was, yes, having the correct traits is important. However, traits aren't the only thing in this high corn rootworm situation that can affect yield. We can still have yield loss that occurs within those traits, and those traits are not infallible. That is called resistance. Resistance to these traits has started to build up. Some of these rootworms are able to make it through these traits and still cause some damage, even in a smart stack with insecticide. So again, looking at that, we can see what some of that data shows and the differences in the yield as well as the feeding and the root rating. So again, the conclusion, the significant yield losses can occur. This is an example of some pruned nodes over there from rootworm. Each node can reduce yields by 15%. We saw some of those numbers. Now, it's not always 15%, but it can be. These plants have, that you're seeing over here in the picture have 3 nodes destroyed, so that's up to 45% yield loss that can occur. So again, corn rootworm is a significant pest in certain parts of the state, and it is up in northwest Iowa where this trial occurred in this corn-on-corn field where we have a known pressure. It is a significant issue in which this farmer is having to deal with. Our next set of trials that we're going to look at are AMS on soybeans. So what am I talking about with AMS? I'm talking about placing an ammonium sulfate fertilizer that is going to be nitrogen and sulfur onto a soybean field. Now, a lot of times we don't place sulfur on soybeans or nitrogen on soybeans for that matter, because we don't usually see that there's that much yield gain potential within that, and we don't usually see that much sulfur deficiency in soybeans. However, a company that we worked with called Advancix They provided us with product, and they looked at us and said, hey, we have had a lot of farmers contact us about, is AMS something that we should put on our soybeans? Or should we add sulfur? Or should we add nitrogen going in there? So we said, okay, let's look at that, because we talked to other farmers in the area, and they said, yes, that is a question we're very interested in. So what this is this is going to be a source of nitrogen and sulfur. Sulfur and nitrogen, as you know, they can both have different effects on the plants. Nitrogen can be known to make the beans taller, bushier in those situations going out there. And one of the biggest issues and biggest, shall we say, problems that we have with this trial is going to be the complexity. And when I talk about complexity, I mean, you said, well, we're only putting one thing on. So we're looking at AMS versus no AMS. That's true. That's not very complex. However, AMS is a dual nutrient. So we're doing dual nutrient testing. So some of the results that we are going to show you on the next slide, you might have a yield advantage. You might have a yield disadvantage. What did that come from? Did it come from the nitrogen component, or did it come from the sulfur component that was in there? We are unable to tell from this trial if it was the nitrogen that had the effect or if it was the sulfur. But when we did this trial initially, we set it up thinking this is a 2-year type of experiment. Year 1, we'd look and see, are we going to see anything? Is there any result whatsoever from adding AMS? Then if we see some results, the next year we might do more of a targeted approach and be like, and look at things and say, okay, now we've got an idea that there can be effect. Now we're going to look at nothing, nitrogen, and sulfur in separate repetitions in order to figure that out. But as you can see from this graph, we had a lot of different locations. So the ability to do all of these locations here at different rates, adding all those other nitrogens, sulfur, control, all of those reps wasn't feasible for us in 2020 due to COVID and other reasons. If we look at this, the trials that we see that have significant differences are now highlighted in red. You can see the yield differences down below. They have the trial number. They will have the county in which the trial was performed in, and then the green will be the AMS yield, and the blue will be the non-treated yield going in there. So as you can see, there are 3 trials that had statistical significance in there. The first one over in Monona, which would be 200, 304. Monona is in west central Iowa. That showed about a 3 bushel advantage to no AMS versus the addition of AMS. Then you look at the trial right next to that in Hancock County, which is in north central Iowa. It showed, again, roughly about a 3 bushel advantage to having the AMS. Okay, well, those are 2 conflicting answers. And we see that a lot when it comes to these trials. And then we have another one, 603 over in Potawatomi. That one showed a 10 bushel advantage to the AMS versus the non-AMS. So the one from Monona, the 304, one of the field observations that we were told about in that trial to look at and to take note of was there was a lot more lodging in those soybeans. Now again, lodging can occur from additional nitrogen added to the field. So that lodging caused some of those beans to fall over, which again caused more harvest loss that was noted by the farmer. Now, does harvest loss mean that there's a reduced yield from the actual plants? No, but if you're unable to harvest those or unable to pick them up, it doesn't matter because that loss is still real. So that is one of the things in 304 that we noticed was that there was an increase in harvest loss due to the addition of the AMS in that trial. Now, we did not note that in any of the other trials, but we did note that in the trial 304. So 406, again, you can see the advantage, and then you can also see the advantage in the Potawatomi County trial 603. Now, what are we going to do with some of these trials in the future? We are going to look at these trials again, and we're going to determine, was there a nitrogen effect? Was there an effect based on sulfur? If you go to the Research Farm report, which I don't have here, but again, if you go to the website like I posted earlier, you can see we do have soil test results for each of these trials and each of these locations. So you can look at the soil tests, you can look at the NPK fertilizer rates and things like that for each of these trials and really dig into the soil type and some of the things that could have possibly occurred within these trials. However, that data is too much to show right here. If you would like that, you can go into those reports. So again, the AMS was shown to have a significant effect in 3 of the 12 trials. So we had 2 trials that had a significant yield advantage, 1 that had a significant yield disadvantage, and then we had 9 trials that showed no advantage or disadvantage. Those 9 trials are just as important in determining your data, because if you're adding AMS, and we'll look at this in another situation here on our next set of trials, you are still paying for that AMS to go onto the plot. So if there is no yield advantage to putting it on there, then all that is a cost that goes into your trial that now you have to make up somewhere on the back end when it comes to profitability. So even if there is no significant yield difference, that is just as important as a data point as if it has more yield or if it has less yield, because knowing that there is no yield advantage to something really can help you in your management decisions. Again, another conclusion was nitrogen sulfur could have been affected of the results. We couldn't really determine which one was which. This data also correlated with other published data. If you go and look at ISU extension publication crop 3072, which is on sulfur management, you can see that a lot of the data that we have here correlates to that in saying that there are some fields that you can see some advantages, but most fields you do not see an advantage or a disadvantage from adding the AMS in there. And that's about what we showed, was that our percentage of plots that had an advantage was very small compared to the percentage that showed no effect whatsoever. But again, I would definitely encourage you to go to the ISU Extension store, download Crop 3072, and look at some of the other sulfur management information that's out there from ISU Extension. Our next set of trials we're going to look at is going to be population trials. So one of the big lines for Iowa State University for soybean populations is what you can read there. What we really like to have at the end of the day is a stand of around 100 to 125,000 plants per acre at harvest. Those usually do not result in significant, that's about what we determine as being a good number for your most economically effective yield and profitability, around 100 to 125. Now, if you plant 180,000 to get to that number, or if you plant below that number and can still come up, you're still looking pretty good. But what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at our population trials for corn and for soybeans and determine what we are looking at across the state of Iowa. And one of the new spins we're putting on it for it this year is we're going to look at profitability. Now, we'll look at that in the next slide. This is an example of the trials that we had. So as you can see, we have trials all over multiple counties, multiple varieties and companies in there for corn and soybeans, and also different planting days, populations, and different tillage practices. So when you look at this and look at some of these other trials, if you are closer to central Iowa, you might look at the Boone trials and say, that's pretty close to what I'm looking at. One thing I will say is on this and all trials in which we look at varieties, we are not looking at varieties as order to have maximum yield, and we're not looking to evaluate varieties on which is a good variety and which is not. They're just used as a median in order to determine the different populations in this particular case, or other ones. That is just the method that we are using. We're not looking at each individual ones to tell which one is better than other as far as total yield out there. So let's look at some soybean populations. And like I said, one of the big things we're looking at this year is seed cost per acre. So if you look at trial 200-101 on the top, you will see that we had multiple planting days. The first thing you will notice is it is very statistically significant, but the statistical significance comes in especially if you look at the planting day. So what we had on there was the planting date of 4/21/20. We had a significant yield loss compared to a planting date of 5/9. So planting it in early April in this particular field didn't hurt the yield that we were looking at out there. But the other portion that we are going to look at is if you look at the seed cost per acre, what is that? You can see on the left, that is my formula that I used. Soybeans at 140 1,000 seeds per bag at $45 per bag. Now, obviously, you might have different costs in there, and you can plug in your own costs in there. That's why I included the formula, so you know what we're talking about. But really, the seed yield profit per acre is the market price, which again, I added down there below on the left, so you can see what I used. You can adjust it as you need, times the yield achieved minus the seed cost. So if we look at our example of 200, 101, up there we had 90, 110, 130, and 150,000 soybeans planted. And our seed yield profit per acre, as you can see, we had a very large difference of almost $100 that you could have made. So if you did the management tactic of planting 150,000 seeds on 421, you were at a $100 seed yield profit disadvantage than if you planted 110,000 on the 9th of May. Now, the planting date had that effect. I understand that. So we can look at that a little differently. Even if you look at just the planting date of 5/9, you can still see a fairly large difference going in there of advantages within profitability. Does it mean that you should plant 90,000? In this situation, that wasn't the most profitable. Should you plant 150,000? In this situation, it was not the most profitable. So again, finding that sweet spot is very important in there. If we look at some of the other trials that we have down there, 403 is an example. We looked at 140,000, one with seed treatment, and then one at 180,000 population. We did not see significant yield differences across the board on any of those. However, again, you can see the profitability on that is going to be very different. So determining what the best population for your field is, determining what makes sense is very important. This is a great example. These two trials are soybean trials that were in Boone, Iowa. And these are a really good example of a very wide berth when it comes to the soybean populations. We have 80,000, 120,000, and 160,000. Now we have two different varieties in here, but these fields were fairly close to each other. I'd say they're less than a mile apart. So if we look at that, the first trial, the 503, you can see we had some significant yield differences in there. The p-value is there. The 160 out-yielded the 120, which it both in turn out-yielded the 80,000 seeds per acre, which is fairly typical with what a lot of farmers would say out in the field would be the more seeds you plant, the more yield you get. Okay, well, obviously in this particular situation, your seed yield profit was the most at the 160,000 seeds per acre. But if we look at a field that is very close to it, less than a mile apart, a different variety, you can see our yields down below on 504 are not significantly different. There are 2 bushel difference at the 80,000. At that point, our profitability is at 120,000 is the one that has the most profitability. Now, as you can see, more yield equals more opportunity for profit in there. But making sure that you can determine the correct population in there and understanding that population really has a large factor on cost and a large factor on your profit is a good thing to think about, because a lot of times people just have it out there, well, I'll just plant 160 for insurance to make sure I get enough. Well, by doing more of that, you are definitely cutting into your ability to gain profit. Here's our corn population trials that we had for 2020. Again, we did not see any statistical significance in yield. However, looking at that, you do see there is a difference in the costs. So if you look at trial 200-308, there was no significant difference in the yield. However, there was significant difference in your pocketbook. If you look at the seed costs and you look at the seed yield profit per acre, that's very different in there looking at that. So again, the conclusions: choose the correct hybrid and variety to fit your system. If you're going to look at a lower population, make sure you choose a lower population hybrid that will thrive in that situation. Conversely, if you're going a higher population, choose a hybrid or variety that will fit in there. That is one thing that can make a huge difference in yield and population dynamics, is choosing the right variety. High soybean seed population does not usually respond to higher yields. We've shown in some cases it does. In other cases, if you look back at that data, it did not. So just going out and planting more soybean seeds will cost you more money and might not always be the most profitable. And then again, last but certainly not least, cost of production should be a factor in your decision making. In 2020, fungicide trials were an interesting dynamic across the state. When looking at those, we looked at 4 separate fungicide trials on soybeans, and we also looked at some on corn. But we'll discuss the soybean fungicide trials first. So as you can see on the top, we had trials in Sioux County, a couple in Webster County. Those were a collaboration with Iowa Central Community College. And then we also had one in Louisa County. If we look at the down below, you can see the treatments that we had. You can see also the yield and the cost per acre that we had for each of those. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about profitability. So of all the yield differences, only one trial, the 200-411, which would have had a Miravis Neo at 13.7 ounces per acre applied at R3 to the soybeans, that one had a 5 bushel yield advantage over the control beans, which did not have any. Now, if you look at some of the other ones, you can see the Approach Prima Preaxor in 200-110 did not have a significant yield difference over the control. However, this is where the cost per acre and the profitability, like I talked about earlier, comes into effect. Because if you do not have enough yield advantage to get a profit, then all of that money is going to have to be made up somewhere else within your system in order to make it work. For corn fungicide trials, we looked at 3 separate trials in there. With these 3 trials, what we looked at was, again, Approach Prima, a Quilt, and a Quilt XL, again, 2 different times on the trials 118 and 119. We looked at these. None of these showed any significant yield advantage. Now, why would you say that we wouldn't have any significant yield advantage? A lot of times people will see a yield advantage or a yield disadvantage, not necessarily a yield disadvantage, but a yield advantage from fungicide. And the main reason we were looking at this, that we were unable to see differences in 2020, was in Iowa, the environmental conditions were not conducive to having disease. So again, the disease triangle on the right, you have to have all of these conditions that are there in order for these fungicides to have an effect on the plants. And this year, the bottom left, the favorable environment was not present. The pathogen could have been present. The susceptible host was present with corn or soybeans. However, the environment was not there for that. What this also showed in our data was preventative applications is not profitable. Just putting information and just putting fungicides out is not a good method for, number one, pest resistance management, but also for your bottom line. Just placing them out there is not a good management practice. You should scout your fields, determine if you need the fungicide, and then pull the trigger and apply the fungicide as needed in the field. Interseeding cover crops was another trial that we did this year out in Iowa. With these, we did 2 separate things. We did a research component of the trials that was on a grant. That part we will not discuss in here, but we will discuss the other portion, which was the on-farm trials portion of the trial. So what the protocol was on this was we were interseeding grass and legume cover crop mixtures into early vegetative stages. We were interseeding into V5 and or V8 growth stages in corn. So what we were looking at is the cover crop mixture, which is pictured to the right, had 24 pounds per acre of rye, 3.5 of red clover, 3.5 pounds per acre of radish, and then 17.5 pounds per acre of cowpeas. And what we were doing in this is we were utilizing this equipment, which was an interseeder that was built at Iowa State University, utilizing a Gandy box on the back of a cabless John Deere tractor, and we used a Dawn Duo seed units. So with these, what we were doing is we were planting 2 individual rows in between each of our crop rows out in the field. And we have a little video next to kind of show you what we did and how that practice worked. So on this video, you can see that we are not broadcasting the seed on top of the ground. What we are doing out here is we are going along in the trials. This individual one is actually in the research trial. is where we are doing this video and this recording, so it will be shorter than an on-farm trial, but you can see what we are looking at in there and how this machine works throughout the field. This is the speed that we would have utilized going all the way across the field. Now this angle, as you can see, is from right down in front of the row units that we are going to go through the plot. The reason why we're showing this is, as you can see, we lower into the ground so that we can put this seed, if you look closely, you can see the seed starting to be dribbled into the unit. And as we go forward, that seed is then planted less than an inch into the ground. This is different than if we were doing a broadcast seeding on top of the ground, which can have not as good of germination throughout the season. That is one of the reasons why we decided to go with this method of interseeding, was so that we could avoid some of that broadcast growth issues. So as you can see, this would be cereal rye that was 9 days after planting. As you can see, you just saw in the video, we have 2 planted lines right there in between our corn rows out there in the field. And here are some of our yield results that you can look at. As you can see, the 3 trials on the left were interseeded at a V5 growth stage in corn, and the 2 on the right were interseeded at a V8 growth stage in corn. Now, the green bars, they will be your cover crop mix, and your blue will be the no cover crop. None of these had a significance of 0.1. So therefore, we would consider these not to have significant yield differences. Now, what is the point of that? The good part about that is, one of the questions that a lot of people have, will my cover crop rob me of yield if I plant it at V5 or if I plant it at V8? And the answers that we came up with in these demonstration trials for this year of 2020 was that no, we were not seeing any significant yield losses due to this earlier season planting of these cover crops within the growing cash crop of corn. Another question people have is, what was the fall biomass? Because that makes a large difference. On the top picture, you can see that would be from one of the research trials that we had, but it was correlative to the on-farm trials. That would be cowpeas and about the standard fall biomass that we had for cowpeas. However, on the bottom, you can see that is our cereal rye. That rye did not have much biomass. It did not grow very well over this last year due to the drought conditions that we had in Iowa, especially in western Iowa, where some of these trials were placed. There was a significant D2, D3 severe drought this year, which really dropped our biomass. So some of the conclusions that we have is we will be doing these trials again in 2021. The research trials, again, will have the individual components, and the on-farm will have, like the picture is showing there, it will have a mixture of those out there in the field. The yield data didn't show any significant yield losses. However, we're not ready to really make any definitive answers on any of that due to the lack of fall biomass and lack of cover crop growth that we saw this year due to the drought conditions. Another very important set of trials that we looked at in 2020 was in association with the Iowa Soybean Association. We looked at soybean date of planting trials. So what we looked at with the date of planting trials is we had 9 trials, and we were really investigating the effect of planting date and the use of fungicide on soybean variety. We were also looking at soybean relative maturity matched by geography. So what we were trying to do was we were planting 2 planting dates, 2 different varieties, one that within its geography would be considered an early maturing bean, and with another one that would be considered a late maturing bean. And what we were really looking at was, if we planted an early bean planted early and a late bean planted early, were there any yield differences or advantages to any of those planting structures? Now, as I said, some of these had fungicide applied to those, some of them did not. Now, we will not be comparing fungicide versus no fungicide in these trials because that wouldn't be a fair comparison. So what we are looking at in these trials in these next few slides will be ones that are either entirely fungicide applied or entirely no fungicide applied to those trials. Here are some of the results that we have for the trials that have fungicides that have been applied. Now, you will notice there is no significant yield difference that we were able to see to our significant level of 0.1 across any of these trials. So you will see that there are some yield differences. However, none of those differences rose to that level of significance. So what we are saying there for these trials in which there was a fungicide applied, there were no differences, except for the one that is highlighted in red. And I will point that out because there was a very significant difference there based on the planting day. However, we did have an infield observation that the 4/21 planting date in Washington County was hit with a fairly severe frost after the planting and after the soybeans were up. So with that, obviously that one had a significant yield difference between the two planting days. However, there was no difference between the varieties on those planting days. So what we are attributing to is an environmental factor. These results right here are ones that did not have any fungicide planted in them, and we will break these down in some other charts that are a little easier to see in the next few slides. I will point out, however, that the first trial again in Washington County has the same thing that occurred, in which there was a significant difference, but it was based on that frost event that did occur. There are two other trials that, like I said, we will break down in the next set of slides to really look at some of the differences that we did see based on variety and based on planting day. So this first trial, 201 and 001 in Lucas County, if you look on the left, you will see that we planted a 3.7 soybean, which would have been a pioneer soybean, on May 2nd. And then we also planted that exact same soybean on June 2nd. And the yield differences in the 3.7 bean, there was no significant yield difference in there. It wasn't significant to any levels of 0.1. Now, if you look on the right, which are circled in red, we saw a 3.1 bean, which was also a pioneer bean, that was planted on 5.2 versus the same bean planted on 6.2. That yield difference of 6 bushels is significant. Now, we did not see any significant yield differences between the two varieties. However, we did see them within the planting date for this particular variety in this trial. Trial 200-405 in Hancock County, we see some of the same trends. We see the later maturing bean in that geography, the 2.6 bean from New Tech. That was planted on 4/20 and on 5/7, if you can see those days. And again, there was no yield difference on there. However, when we planted a 2.0 bean, which would have been an earlier bean for that geography in north central Iowa, we did have a significant 4 bushel advantage for the earlier planting versus the late planting. And again, in Boone County, we see some of the same consistent results in there, in which we have a 2.8 bean, which was planted on a 4/20 and a 5/7 planting date, not seeing any differences. And there was a 1 bushel significant yield advantage for the 2.4 bean that was planted on 4/20 versus the same bean that was planted on 5/7. Now, that 1 yield bushel advantage, a lot of times you can say, how can that be consistent? It's only 1 bushel. However, if we go back to the beginning and we talk about the statistics, all of the repetitions showed that the 2.4 planted on 4/20 was better than the one that was planted on 5/7. So that planting day did make a difference significantly in Boone County. And again, here is just a reminder of these are the trials that we looked at and what we had going in there in the previous slides. I would also like to point out that there are trials that did not show significant difference in Pottawatomie and Adair County. And if that is the area that you are from, you can look at those down there and see that we used anywhere from a 3.0 to a 2.5 bean in those situations, and we didn't see any of those differences. So the conclusions that we came to from this trial, that, like I said, we had a great partnership with the Iowa Soybean Association, was most trials did not show a significant difference of planting day and maturity. However, some early maturing varieties had more variation in the yield differences, and that was based on the planting day. We will also be continuing these trials in 2021. Corn fertilizer trials were the next set of trials that we looked at across the state of Iowa. With corn fertilizer trials, as you can see, we looked at a lot of micronutrients. Micronutrients right now are very popular for people trying to gain a yield advantage on their fields out there by adding all of these additions. So we looked at sulfur, we looked at some manganese, some zinc, boron, and then we also looked at some other fertilizers like some AMS that was applied out there as well. Now, looking at some of these trials, sulfur can be called, it's not really a micronutrient, it's kind of an in-between nutrient in there, and we have seen some advantages to sulfur on corn in given situations. However, this year, in the trials that we were showing, for the nutrients on corn, there were no trials that had a significant advantage to the 0.1 level. Now, again, you can look across there and you can see some yield differences. The nutrient added will be in green and the control will be in blue. So as you can see, there's some where the control is more and others where the nutrient is more. But none of these reach to a level of significance that would allow us to say adding that micronutrient to that field on this particular year in that area would have made a yield significant difference. So if you added money to put in there for these trials, that would have been money that you could have spent on something else rather than have those in there for this particular trial. We also looked at alfalfa fertilizer because one of the things we looked at on this is we looked at gypsum as the sulfur added to alfalfa, because we have seen in the past that some fields sulfur can really help those alfalfa yields. So what we looked at this year is we looked at two different trials that we conducted, and we had gypsum that was applied to these fields, and we did in three different strategies. The first strategy was we put on 20 pounds of actual sulfur. It was added in a single application at the beginning of the year prior to first cutting. The second was we had 20 pounds of actual sulfur added after each cutting, so we had three separate cuttings, an application early in the season, an application right after the first cutting, and an application right after the second cutting, so each of those subsequent cuttings would be able to utilize that sulfur that you applied. Now, when we look at the data that we have there, we have the two trials averaged together because they ended up being about exactly the same, so that's why we're showing these together. So as you can see, there was no significant difference for each of the trials. So in the first cutting, we could have those would all be in blue. The second cutting will all be in orange, and the third cutting will all be in gray. We did not see any significant differences across the methodologies of sulfur application or the no sulfur. We did not see that across cuttings, and we did not see it also across a total amounts that we received for all of that alfalfa at the end of the year. The tonnage did not increase significantly across total each cutting or at the end of the year. So the conclusions that we have for these fertilizer trials was the micronutrients did not show any significant differences in yield for the corn. The data from these trials does correlate with other ISU research, and if you would like more information on some micronutrients for soybeans, crops 3135, which is at the extension store as well, is a good reference for some of those micronutrients that we have on soybeans out there. It also, I believe, has some information on corn micronutrients, but mostly it is focused on soybean. But again, there's a lot of questions on those. We this year did not do any trials on micronutrients on soybeans that I'm talking about here today, but there are some that would be in the research farm reports if you look at those when they're published on the website. So overall today, a summary of the trials that we've looked at. We've looked at some disease and pest management. We looked at AMS on soybeans, and then we also looked at populations, fungicide, interseeding of cover crops, the date of planting trials, and corn and alfalfa fertilizer trials. Now, I would like to point out that if you're watching this on demand, as you probably are, you can go back, pause the video, and I would encourage you to do that in certain sections on some of those charts if you want more time to look at them, to make sure that you can study those and figure out what's going on in those trials as you are looking, because I do know some of those go pretty fast and there was a lot of information on there. So I would encourage you to go back and re-watch those to make sure that you get exactly what you want out of those charts. I would also like to give a shout out and a very large thank you to the support of the Iowa State Extension field agronomists across the state. If you're watching this from the state of Iowa, find your county, find your local agronomists, and thank them for their help with these ISU on-farm trials. Without their help and assistance and the assistance of the research farm staff, we would not be able to get these trials this year or any year to bring you this data on relative information that farmers in the state of Iowa really want to know. Also, if you have any ideas for any trials, feel free to reach out to your local agronomist or reach out to myself, and we will be able to get you in contact with your local farm staff, and we will be able to get you on the right track to get some demonstration trials in your own fields so that you can look at data and things that matter to you out there on a day-to-day basis and see if you can be more profitable in your fields. So again, I'd like to say thank you for attending today and watching this on the ISU on-farm trials. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is right there on the screen. Also, the website below, the istatedigitalpress.com farm reports, that is where you can go to find all of this information so you can download it. It's free, and you can look at this information for yourself on the individual farms in the area where you are at to determine what you would like. Thank you.